Hi guys, I hope you are thriving and doing very well today. If you are interested in private coaching, go to www.coachcat.org. Today, what I'm going to talk about is some of the sort of dysfunctional thinking patterns that either keep you stuck in a toxic or dysfunctional or narcissistic relationship, and where some of these sort of cognitive distortions might have come from, and sort of the root of, possible codependent symptoms. So what types of thinking will allow us to stay stuck in relationships? So cognitive distortions are sort of like these stories or these sort of lies almost that we tell ourselves. And likely we've had these cognitive distortions from childhood. Quite often, people that had childhood trauma develop the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. Fawn response is the codependent, people-pleasing, accommodating, not rocking the boat, sort of morphing into what other people want, not having a strong sense of self. Those are some of the traits that might have sort of allowed you to stay in these cognitive distortions, which can put you in a position to be hurt for the possibility of love and approval. So what types of thinking? Well, codependents in general, what they tend to do is they tend to often sacrifice their own beliefs for the sake of pleasing or pacifying another person or the relationship. A lot of times codependents have a hard time identifying what they're feeling, what their needs are, what their wants are, and they tend to trust other people more than they trust themselves, right? So they'll put somebody above them in relationship. They'll allow somebody to take sort of the superior position. Codependents may have abandonment trauma from childhood, where they feel very anxious in relationships, and they're often feel like their partner might leave them. They might leave them for someone better, or they might leave them because they're not worthy, or they're not lovable, or they're not good enough. This fear usually comes from early childhood attachment problems. And, as a tiny kid, they might not have had sort of consistent care or had their needs met in a consistent fashion. And this could have been because they had a parent that was addicted, narcissistic, emotionally unavailable, depressed, overwhelmed. There may have been too many kids, not enough money, there was poverty, there was chaos. And so that child might have not had their needs met in a very consistent fashion. I realize for me, and I often share some of my own personal stories so that you can so I can share my experience, strength, and hope and my journey so that maybe some of you will relate to it. But I found out that my little baby brother died. He was maybe, I think, a little bit over a year after I was born. My mom had another baby, a boy, and he died. And so my mother, when I was a little bit older than 1 year old, had the death of a child. So she was in a deep state of mourning and grief. And we also had, there was 7 babies born in our home. We had a lot of poverty. We had a lot of chaos. My dad had addiction issues. So there was a lot of sort of instability. And I think my mother is a very loving, kind person, but I think that she just was absolutely overwhelmed, grief-stricken, and didn't really have the type of, she couldn't probably attune to me in a consistent fashion. So my siblings end up raising me. We all kind of raised each other, right? So just to give you an example of sort of where this sort of thing can come from, it doesn't mean even that your parents were bad people. Even if they were narcissistic or addicted, like they're coming from their own wounding, right? Their own wounding. Most of the time, I don't think people deliberately hurt others. There's some exceptions to that if they're sociopathic or psychopathic or maybe very malignant narcissists, then they do. But in general, people are acting out of their own wounding, and they're usually doing the best they can with the tools that they have in their toolbox. But the codependent will often feel like their needs don't matter, and they had a problem with attachment with their parent, with their caregiver, right? So they may end up feeling broken, unworthy, like there's something missing, wrong with them, there's something defective about them. And just if you feel this way, just know that this is not your fault. This came from your early childhood software programming. That's how I like to look at it, like a computer program that was downloaded. And so this is your programming. And anything that is learned behavior, I believe, can actually be unlearned. So I think that's sort of this journey, is unlearning some of that negative belief system, some of those cognitions that we're telling ourselves. And you know, a lot of times codependents will feel unwanted, ashamed of themselves, unworthy, not enough. And when you have those distortions, those cognitive distortions, you may stay in an abusive relationship because of this deep fear of abandonment. Like in some level, it's like, nobody's gonna love me, I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy, I'm broken. So you might stay and allow abuse or toxic behaviors much more than somebody who has sort of secure attachment, right? Where they see those red flags and they're like, oh yeah, I'm not gonna be treated this way. And quite often with the narcissistic relationship, it's like a frog being boiled in water. You don't even know necessarily that it's happening, especially if you're with like a covert, neglectful narcissist, where it's like very slow, very subtle. Over time, you're being devalued. And if you already have core issues where you lack this feeling of being worthy, you have self-worth issues, then that person, you know, when they're showing you through their actions that they don't value you, all they're really, you know, doing with that behavior is reinforcing what you're already telling yourself with your cognitive distortions, with these sort of stories that have been imprinted in there that you're telling yourself. So here the narcissist comes around and they show you either through their words or their actions that you are not valuable, that you're not worthy. Then all it is reinforcing this lack of self-worth that you're already believing. Somebody who has really good self-worth won't believe it when somebody who's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs is devaluing them. They'll be like, oh, you're devaluing me. That's something wrong with you, because I am worthy and I am valuable. Bye-bye, sayonara. And so I'm hoping that all of you guys in this community will start to develop this sort of self-worth. So when you meet somebody who tries to devalue you, you're like, nah, no, I don't believe that about myself. So I'm not going to listen to that or tolerate that sort of abuse from you, right? So a lot of times codependents tend to doubt their ability to take care of themselves. And someone with this type of thinking may stay in a dysfunctional abusive relationship because they doubt themselves. They may have fears of economic insecurity. And a lot of times sometimes narcissists or sociopaths can be very good with sort of money because they're exploiters, so they're good at amassing money because they don't have any empathy or qualms around stealing money or doing whatever they're doing to get their money. So a lot of times they can be really good with money, or they can also have the workaholism. So they're good with money and they use money to control and to have power over other people. They love money. They equate it with love. So if you're a codependent and you feel like you can't take care of yourself, or you're not good enough, you're not worthy, you might find yourself in a financially dependent position with a narcissist. They love that because they get power. They love for you to be financially dependent on them, but then they will shame you for the same dependence. And they typically don't recognize any non-monetary contributions to relationships. So if you're doing all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the grocery shopping, all the planning, all the trips, all of that, you're doing all of that, they're not going to recognize that as anything valuable, right? Because they just feel entitled to those things. You should be doing those things because you're their slave and you're just lucky to share their airspace, right? So that's kind of how they look at it. And they don't have anything in them that says, oh, it's not okay to exploit others. They think it's perfectly acceptable because they're special, right? They're very entitled. Their money is their money and your money is their money. So if you're a codependent, you may have grown up in an enmeshed family that had a lack of boundaries, and you may not be very good at setting boundaries. So when you get in your adult life, you meet a toxic manipulator or an abuser or a narcissist or an alcoholic or an addict, you might get enmeshed with them and develop a codependent relationship because you don't have healthy, strong core sense of self and healthy boundaries to be able to differentiate yourself from another person, right? So at the core, sometimes with codependence, there's also this sort of, not a true knowing of yourself, right? So another maladaptive sort of cognitive distortion is that this idea that if you're codependent, that you're inadequate, you're a failure, you may compare yourself to others and find yourself less than, you may be very perfectionistic and you feel that you have to be perfect in order to be loved. And the more you feel unworthy or like a failure or not good enough, the more likely it is that you are going to stay in an abusive, dysfunctional, non-communicative, manipulative relationship. You may also be a conflict avoider. If you grew up in a family, there was a lot of conflict, there was verbal screaming, or there was physical abuse, you may be very afraid of that, and you may be a conflict avoider. And so you often give up control in a situation because you avoid conflict, because at the core of it, you have this deep fear of abandonment, right? And so you might tolerate all sorts of things you wouldn't normally because of that fear of conflict. Sometimes you think it's better to give away your control and acquiesce to another person, and you'll do this to avoid conflict, pain, any sort of retribution, and it may be very hard for you to stand up for yourself in relationships and to clearly state what your needs are. You might be easily bullied, and you might have been bullied as a child, you might have been abused, and so again, you might stay in a position to be hurt for the possibility of love and approval. And then also, you may have been raised with this idea that it's okay for you to sacrifice your needs at the altar of another person. You may actually feel that it's selfish to take care of your own needs and wants, and it's better to put somebody else above yourself. You might have actually been indoctrinated with that idea in your family of origin, either verbally or by modeling, if you saw that in the dynamic of the parent, of your parents' relationship. So oftentimes, codependents will sacrifice themselves at the altar of the great narcissist. You tend to put your needs last. You may actually feel, again, selfish if you put your needs first. But this can lead to resentment, a sense of failure, and extreme anxiety, right? If you're constantly saying yes when you really mean no, you are probably going to develop some resentments. And the way it was put to me, I think this was Ross Rosenberg, and this made a lot of sense to me. If a codependent is in a relationship with a narcissist, there are two people in a relationship, and both of them are worried about only one person, the narcissist. The narcissist is worried about themselves and only themselves, and the codependent is worried about the narcissist and only the narcissist. So do you see how this is not a reciprocal relationship? Both parties are worried about just the narcissist, and so that person's needs are getting met where the codependents typically aren't. That's not an egalitarian relationship. You may tend to be, if you're codependent, another sort of, these are all some of the ways of being and the ways that you may be expressing yourself in this world. You may tend to anticipate others' needs and, again, always put them above yourself. Many codependents tie their self-esteem to gaining the love and approval of others. In order to feel worthy, you might think that you need to gain another person's approval or validation. And often the codependent is the one that is trying to gain approval from a narcissist. And of course, we know narcissists are never satisfied. They can never be pleased. So it's a moving bar. As soon as you meet their expectations, then they move it, right? So you're constantly trying to scramble to meet the expectations and gain little crumbs of approval from somebody who will never be satisfied, because at the core of narcissism is this insatiable need for supply, right? More. They can never, ever just be happy or content or satisfied with what they have, right? So, So in order to be a whole person, an integrated person, I think it's really important to come to the place where you accept that you do not need another person's validation and approval to be okay. And that's part of the codependence journey, is to start learning how to self-validate, how to look for the approval of yourself. And I also think of it like I believe in God, so I'm looking for God's approval and for God's validation rather than human beings. I'm trying on that journey. It's totally a work in progress, but I'm looking to start to, really learn how to trust myself, self-validate, and give myself the approval that I'm seeking from the outside world, if that makes sense. So you need your own approval, not others. And I think that's so important. And I think it's also so important to start to realize that some of these dysfunctional thinking patterns, some of these sort of cognitive schemas or distortions that you have, like these were learned behaviors and you can unlearn them. And part of unlearning them is awareness. Like, oh, right now I'm acting in this people-pleasing manner to try to accommodate somebody else because I don't want them to think I'm not a nice guy or nice girl. And I'm really saying yes when I really internally mean no. And so always check your motives. Like, what's my motive here? Am I doing this thing because I want somebody to like me or think I'm really nice? Or am I doing this because it's a self-honoring behavior, right? So a lot of times that means you've got to get really comfortable at saying no. You have to get very comfortable at being able to exit relationships that are either toxic or dysfunctional early on before you get sucked into this really, really sick dynamic. Definitely exists in codependent relationships with narcissists. Toxic people are in relationships with others. The narcissist is in a relationship with others not because they want love. They want dominance, control, and supply. They are not in relationship to relate to others, to understand others, to love others, to build reciprocity and connection. They want dominance, control, power, and supply. So do you see how this is a very uneven dynamic? If you're a codependent, to be in that kind of relationship is going to be very harmful for you. Yeah, it may be very hard if you're a codependent to express your truth or your needs. It might be very scary for you. But just like a toddler when they're learning how to walk, if you can start learning how to set healthy boundaries, how to get very dialed in on your core values and to be very true to those core values, then when somebody comes along that isn't in line with your core values, you don't have to hate them. All you have to do is be like, oh, this person, even as a friend, they're not in line with my core values. We do not share the same core values. So we're not a good fit for relationships. So I can just exit this. I'm not obliged to be friends, lovers, married to anyone. Like, I get to choose. So that's the thing about building your own agency. Like, there's no hostages here, right? So we don't get to take hostages, and other people don't get to take us hostage. We have a choice. And as a codependent, if you are early on in a relationship and you start to see those red flags, what are the red flags? I've made a lot of videos on them, but a few of them are their actions are not matching their words. They say one thing, but their actions are showing another thing. That is a red flag, right? If there's intermittent reinforcement, or if there's weirdness with the communication, or you're feeling like there's some secretive, sneaky sort of stuff going on, like these are all red flags. Or if they start to devalue you in some way, or if they have you on too big of this crazy pedestal where you feel like it's like almost fantasy based, some sort of fairy tale pedestal, that's a red flag. If they're overly flattering and really just telling you they love you within the first month, or they're just like, crazy about you, but it's like feels off, really dial into your intuition. Really listen to yourself and start to learn to trust yourself, to validate yourself, and to not need another person's approval in order for you to be okay. Because if you think about it this way, if you're codependent and you're with a narcissist, you are literally going to somebody for approval and validation who is absolutely cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. They are incapable of even having self-love. So how could they possibly love you or validate you? You're going to somebody who's ill-equipped to tell you how to feel about yourself. So I hope this video was helpful, and I think just starting to recognize these patterns and some of these cognitive distortions that we developed in childhood can really help you with your codependence, and can really help you just by being aware and to start to notice, oh, I'm acting out of this need for validation. I'm acting out of this fear of conflict. I'm saying yes when I really mean no. I'm not going to do that, right? And really establish, set, and maintain healthy, clear boundaries. I hope you guys are thriving and doing radical self-care. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.